Great. Well, thank you for that opening prayer. I I was messaging with Nick this week, and he mentioned something about why would we be praying if the claim of this week's lesson is that God is an atheist, right? And so what do I mean by that? So I call this why God is an atheist, and so that's what I want to jump into. This is part of our larger series of studies we've been doing on the book of Isaiah, and what I want to focus on today is, well, when we think about monotheism, there's within monotheism a claim that God exists, right? So this is a positive claim of belief. But there's also inherent in monotheism a claim of unbelief, right? It's not just that God exists, but it's that the gods, the many gods of the other surrounding nations and cultures do not exist. So inherent in monotheism is also a claim of unbelief. And so what I want to do today is look at two passages in Isaiah that emphasize that side of unbelief, for why you should not believe in the gods. And perhaps, somewhat, well, it's kind of fun that this is done in the voice of God. This is God speaking through the prophet Isaiah, denouncing belief in the gods. And so what we're going to do today is look at two passages in Isaiah, chapters 40 and 41. And then I have three questions for us to discuss. I'll raise them throughout our discussion as we go through and look at Isaiah. And then we're going to go into small groups, and I'm going to send us into smaller groups where we can reflect more on what do we do with God's atheism, with this idea that God does not believe in the gods. And I think there's going to be some fun implications for how we think about religion today. And I think it's also quite relevant for, right now we live in a perhaps largely secular context or background, where we often want to promote belief, and we think that's a positive thing to do. But if the Bible also is promoting unbelief, it's promoting skepticism, right? I think this gives a more balanced view of religion, as there's both a positive side of belief, but there's also a side of unbelief, and faith entails both of these things, at least a monotheistic faith. And so perhaps that'll help us to tease out the tension a little bit and help us think about, well, when should we embrace the skeptical position? And when should we embrace the posture of belief, right? And so what differentiates between these two, and when should we apply which posture? And so what I'm going to do is just jump right into the text. I'm going to read our first text that looks at a statement of God's atheism, and that's Isaiah 40 verses 18 through 23. And so I want someone to see, perhaps you can find that for us and read it for us, Isaiah 40. 18 through 23. And as you read, I just want you to be listening. What do you notice is God's critique of the gods? Why are the gods, why is worship of the gods absurd, right? So can someone read Isaiah 40 verses 18 through 23?
I can read it.
Awesome. Thanks, Sarah.
No problem. So Isaiah 40, 18 through what again?
23.
Okay. To whom can you compare God? What image can you find to resemble him? Can he be compared to an idol formed in a mold, overlaid with gold and decorated with silver chains? Or if people are too poor for that, they might at least choose wood that won't decay and a skilled craftsman to carve an image that won't fall down. Haven't you heard? Don't you understand? Are you deaf to the words of God? The words he gave before the world began? Are you so ignorant? God sits above the circle of the earth. The people below seem like grasshoppers to him. He spreads out the heavens like a curtain and makes his tent from them. He judges the great people of the world and brings them all to nothing.
Thank you, Sarah. So as you were listening to that reading, what did you notice was God's critique of worship of the gods? What is absurd about it?
That there's no comparison, right? There's no comparison between any gods and God himself.
Mm-hmm. And what's absurd about this worship of the various gods?
I would say one key feature is they are associated with something in the natural world, be it gold, silver, wood, or even stone or plaster, I think they said in some cases. And it's interesting to me, the comment that they made, does not rot. Pretty much everything decays at some point, even stone, which we seem to think as permanent, actually changes through the years. The monuments made that we see nowadays look very different in the past. So it's very interesting to me that the mindset of these individuals is that this thing will not rot, this thing will not decay, where what I often emphasize in chemistry is everything breaks down eventually. We're talking about material world.
Great. So there you emphasize these things will come to an end. One of the things we have in the text is God critiques them by just describing the process by which they made them. He's like, let's demystify your worship a little bit. Let's just like talk about, where did these gods come from? Well, you went, and he goes through the process. It's like, you went down, you found a goldsmith, you covered it with some gold, you put some chains on it. Maybe you couldn't afford that, so you got a nice piece of wood. You carved that wood, you set it up in a place. And so he's just revealing that, like, you made this stuff, right? Anyone else? Any other observations on this text, on the absurdity of worshiping these gods?
There's a couple messages in the chat, FYI.
Great. Yeah, let's take a look at those. Emphasizing entropy again. That's right. That these things will come to an end. The idol representatives are finite. Yeah, there was quite a contrast there between how Yahweh sits above the world, and we're all like grasshoppers compared to him, and in contrast to these finite representations.
I just want to shout out. He says the circle of the earth, not the square of the earth or the plane of the earth.
Yeah, we'll reserve discussions of the flat earth for another occasion, but there's plenty to be talked about there. And then he attacks the idea of humanism, humans as gods. Yeah, that's really insightful as well, that Yahweh sits above the world and we are all but as grasshoppers to him, right? And they can't even stand their own, they're trampled. Great. Yeah, these gods fall over. You can think of some biblical accounts where that has actually happened, right? But I want to look at one key word in this passage that stood out to me. And it was in the first verse 18. To whom will you liken God, or what likeness compare with him? That word likeness, what does it remind you of? Where else have you heard that language of the likeness of God?
Exodus 20.
Okay, you can go back to Exodus. What if you go even further back? Yeah, I see in the
Genesis, story of creation.
That's exactly right. Genesis 1:26, right? We have God creates humanity in his likeness. And as I was reflecting on that and how this verse brings us back to Genesis, I was reminded of a quote. It's often attributed to the Enlightenment thinker Voltaire. So Voltaire was a critic of Christianity. And Voltaire's critique of religion, he puts it this way. He says, in the beginning, God created man in his own image. And then he goes on, and man has been trying to repay the favor ever since. And so Voltaire's critique of religion is, we have this view God has made a man, but then you look at our religious expressions and they just seem all too human, right? Just how God exposes these idols as something you've made. Voltaire was looking at more modern forms of Christianity in the 1700s, and then it was this 1800s, and trying to expose them as they look all too human as well. And so the first question I want us to begin thinking about, and we'll do this in breakout groups, but we can also spend a minute on it now, are what are some of the ways that we fashion God after our likeness? Now, probably too many of us haven't taken our gold, right, and made it into some kind of statue. But are there ways in which perhaps we draw upon our politics, our culture, our personality, whatever it might be, to create God after our own likeness? Can anyone think of how we may do that ourselves, even within Christianity?
the level of hero worship in our society is pretty much off the charts, both within and without Christianity. And there are hosts of people, whether in the sports world or in the religious world or in the political world, that we pretty near deify and relate to their words as sacrosanct at some level.
Wonderful. Yeah, Jason.
Well, in the sports world, we even have some that we refer to as the king.
maybe it's a little bit too pointed for us this morning. Anyone else? What are some ways that perhaps we might be tempted to be creating God after our own image? And if God were to look down upon our form of worship, he would do a similar critique of, what are you doing? You just prop up, maybe not your gold, maybe not your best wood, maybe your culture, maybe your politics, maybe what are some of those ways that we see in the church today?
I think one thing I'm seeing is we're borrowing some ideas from psychology in some cases that are, I hear this argument being circulated around the idea that free will doesn't really exist because it's mainly just a predictable chemical reaction. And this is leading some people to say, well, I can't change this because this is just part of my biology, part of my chemistry. And so they don't seek to, and I think there's a balance point there, obviously, but I've noticed some individuals choosing to basically say, I'm not going to change about myself because it's sort of chemically predetermined.
Interesting. Okay. Well, maybe I'll save this for further discussion in our breakout rooms. I think we can probably think of many examples in which, you could almost imagine two churches that both claim to be worshiping God, and both within the same, perhaps, Christian tradition, but just the way they present that God is so entirely different. The way that it's been developed from their own political sensibilities, their own personalities. We want God to be on our side. We want God to vote like we vote. We want God to be offended at things we're offended at, and we don't want God to offend us, right? And so perhaps we should do a little bit more self-reflection on if we ourselves sometimes return the favor to God of making him after our own image. I want to jump to one more passage now. We'll have more time to discuss that in breakout groups, but this is now Isaiah 41. It's another statement of God's atheism, or if you don't like that, it's God's critique of the gods. It's Isaiah 41, verses 21 through 29. And so if someone could help us locate that, Isaiah 41, 21 through 29. And as we read this passage, I want you to be listening to what is God's critique of these gods? What are they unable to do? What are they? How do they come up short? Someone have that, Isaiah 41, 21 through 29.
So let me read the first 5 verses. Present your case, says the Lord. Bring forth your strong reasons, says the King of Jacob. Let them bring forth and show us what will happen. Let them show the former things, what they were, that we may consider them and know the latter end of them, or declare to us things to come. Show the things that are to come hereafter, that we may know that you are gods. Yes, do good or do evil, that we may be dismayed and see it together. Indeed, you are nothing, and your work is nothing. He who chooses you is an abomination.
If somebody can jump in with 25 to 29.
Yeah, I can do that. I have raised up one from the north, and he shall come. From the rising of the sun, he shall come on my name, and he shall come against princes, as though mortar, as the potter treads clay. Who has declared from the beginning, that we may know, and former times, that we may say, he is righteous. Surely there is no one who shows. Surely there is no one who declares. Surely there is no one who hears your words. The first time I said to Zion, look, there they are, and I will give to Jerusalem one who brings good tidings. For I looked, and there was no man. I looked among them, but there was no counselor. Who, when I asked of them, could answer a word? Indeed, they are all worthless. Their works are nothing. Their molded images are wind and confusion.
Wonderful. So what is God's critique here? Well, how did the gods come up short? What were they unable to do?
Anything.
That's right. He goes kind of both extremes, right? He's like, can you tell us anything about the past? Nope. Can you tell us the future? Nope. Can you do good? Can you do evil? Can you do anything, right? What in particular were they unable to do? What historical event is in mind here?
I mean, the idea that comes to my mind is the idea of creation, how things came to be.
Okay, certainly you can think of like some echoes like language in Job, like where were you when and if we read the entire chapters, we would have some of that. You were not present at the foundations of the world, right? But I think immediately there's a political event, a national event taking place here, where God's talking about how he brings down one from the north, and no one was able to foresee this, right? Like, this giant national catastrophe, and in the immediate context of speaking, it's just the gods were not able to anticipate this. There was no one who declared it, no one who proclaimed it. And then in verse 29, he ends by what I'm not sure, I forgot what your word was, Tendai, for verse 29, is behold, they are all weak or something like this. They are all worthless. Yeah, worthless. So I'm reading from the New King James. No, I'm sorry, it's English Standard Version, and it says they're all a delusion. And so as I just listen to this language, it begins in verse 21. Use your reason, bring forth your proofs, right? Like let's just think about this. He goes through, these gods are worthless, they're all a delusion. As I hear this critique, and this in part is what inspired the title, God is an Atheist, is it sounds a lot like an atheist critique of religion. Like, let's just be reasonable. Let's think about, what religion really is doing. And it's kind of a delusion, right? I mean, you've probably heard that kind of, the God delusion is
the God delusion.
One well-known critique by Dawkins, right? So you have this language very common in the atheist community. And here God's the one using it to describe religion. And so what I want us to do for just a minute, and this is the second question I'll have us discuss in our groups when we move out to them in a couple minutes, is can you think of any atheist critiques of religion today that Yahweh, the God we're reading here, would be sympathetic to? Do any come to mind? I see some in the chat. Oh yeah, just echoing the question. Yeah, can you think of any atheist critiques today that God would be sympathetic to?
Eternal hell for 60 years of rebellion on this earth. The first 8 years, you had no idea what was going on anyway. And or of a little child. I was listening to who's this guy out in Garden Grove, California? Don't tell me. Anyway, very famous preacher here, has his own seminary and everything. And he was, John MacArthur. There it is. Thank you, Jason. He was, or Karen, excuse me, or whatever. He was giving all the reasons for hell, going through the Bible and eternal hell. And he asked the question, he said, so what if somebody was only 8 or 9 years old? He said, and they die and they didn't accept Jesus. He said, well, for 8 or 9, or for, some of their lifetime, they were against God. Do you realize what it is to be against the holy God and not respond to the holy God? They deserve it. And I mean, just unbelievable. Unbelievable. So that would be a reason that your question again was
some atheist critiques that
Yeah.
God would be sympathetic
yeah,
to.
right. So they would say, no, they can't. If that's the kind of God, forget it.
Living in a
Yeah, Charles Darwin referred to everlasting hellfire as a
Well-
damnable doctrine.
Absolutely.
living in a communist country, the abundance of books against Christianity and against any form of religion was obviously, you couldn't pass by a bookstore without even seeing in a window all of these books. And besides the ones that were a little bit more scholarly, in a sense scholarly, because I don't have time to talk about how scholarly they were. Okay, like depicting the Christianity as a myth, and many times not even taking the time to look at the verse in the Bible. So it will say something like 2 Corinthians 20 verse 19, and going on and saying some silly thing that they thought is in the Bible, and not even verifying if that chapter existed. Okay, so besides the fact that many of them were not even scholarly or abominably stupid, but some of them were more scholarly. So there was a whole bunch of books depicting Christianity as a myth. But the other big argument of the atheists against Christianity was the atrocity, saints getting angry with each other over doctrine. And I have numerous titles. Of course, I probably, they will not make that much sense if I translate it from my language into English, but it was kind of along the angry saints, the flames of hell, and of course the flames of Inquisition. And the fights between in Northern Ireland were very in the 60s and 70s when I was still in my country, were very, very vicious fights between the Catholics and the Protestants. And all of those were taken and amplified and used against any existence of God and any seriousness of his worshippers, his followers. Besides suffering and Holocaust and all of that stuff that was attributed to roots in Christianity, the anti-Semitism and stuff of that sort. So the atheists had a big heyday with those kinds of events in the history of Christianity.
So in just a minute, I'll move us into our breakout groups, and you can share some more that come to mind. Of perhaps sometimes you hear atheist critiques, and yet it perhaps is a critique that God himself would sympathize with, right? Or God himself would express if we had a prophetic voice like Isaiah today. There's a quote I just shared in the chat, and it's from the daughter of Bertrand Russell. So Bertrand Russell was one of a very prominent logician, mathematician in the 20th century, but he was also an outspoken atheist. But his daughter came to embrace Christianity. And she writes this book called My Father, Bertrand Russell. And within the book, she reflects a little bit upon her interactions with her father and how she wished she could have shared the Christian hope with him. And so I'll just highlight a little bit of the quote. You can read the fuller one I just dropped in the chat. But she says, I would have liked to convince my father I had found what he had been looking for, the ineffable something he had longed for all his life. I would have liked to persuade him that the search for God does not have to be in vain. But it was hopeless. He had known too many blind Christians, bleak moralists, who sucked the joy from life and persecuted their opponents. He would never have been able to see the truth they were hiding. He should have been a saint. Perhaps he was a saint, even without the faith. God's gadfly, sent to challenge the smugness of the churches with a righteousness greater than their own. And I really appreciate this sympathetic take on Russell's atheism, that there's a sense in which, you know, he was onto something, in a sense in which he was doing at least half the job of critiquing false expressions of belief in God, right? Exposing the all too human elements of it. But I want to move to a last question. And to set up the last question, I just want to play with this idea that the early Christians were in fact accused of being atheists. So I'll share one more quote in the chat, which comes from Justin Martyr in his apology. So his apology is his attempt to give a defense for Christianity. It's where we get the term apologetic from. It's a defense. And in his defense for Christianity, he highlights that the early Christians have been accused of being atheists for the reason that they weren't participating in the worship of the emperor and of the Roman gods, right? And so when you look at him engaging with this, his response is to claim the title. He says, "We are called atheist, and we confess that we are atheist. So far as gods of this sort are concerned," has in view here a particular view of the Roman gods, and then, you know, going back to the Greek gods and all of the baggage that comes with them. And then he goes on, though, he says, "But not with respect to the most true God, the Father of righteousness and temperance and other virtues, who is free from all impurities," trying to draw a contrast. For this is why we believe this God and not these other gods. And so my last question for us to chat about, and we can spend a minute doing it now, and I'll send us to the breakout groups, is what distinguishes Yahweh from the other gods? Right? Why are we an atheist? Sometimes the question is asked with regard to all these other gods, but not to the Christian God. Well, maybe that's really a rich question, and maybe I'll let you just save the discussion for the breakout rooms, because I can imagine us going quite deep into that. So let's go ahead and move into our discussion groups now. There are 3 questions we're trying to engage with. I put them in the chat. The first one is, what are some of the ways that we fashion God after our own likeness? How can we guard against this? The second question we're asking is, what are some of the, that is the same question. The second question is, Yahweh's assessment of religion as delusional echoes that of many atheists. What atheist critiques of religion today might Yahweh be sympathetic to? And then the last question we're asking is, what distinguishes Yahweh from the other gods? So I'll drop those in the chat, and I'm going to send us into breakout groups right now where we can discuss these for about 15 minutes, and then we'll come back together and conclude together and talk about some of the things you shared in your breakout group. So here we go.